Chapter 13. Lichfield. Johnson's legacy left Barber independent and well off, able to make his own choices and to put them into effect. In fact, he was forced to do so, as the home he had enjoyed for so many years with Johnson was now no more, and he had to find somewhere to live. By October of 1785 he had decided to leave London altogether, although he did not do so immediately. After some 34 years in the capital, he started a new life in Lichfield. Barber had good reasons for choosing to settle there. It was familiar territory, as he had accompanied Johnson there on several occasions and had stayed for weeks at a time, easily long enough to come to know such a small city, and to become known there. It was also a place where the Barber family could live much more cheaply than in London. Barber, after all, had never had anything like the sum of money he now possessed, and there were plenty of people in London who would be happy to help him dispose of it. And weighing heavily on Barber were Johnson's exhortations not long before his death that he should move to Lichfield. Barber still felt a strong sense of obligation to comply with his master's wishes. It was probably not until August 1786 that Francis, Elizabeth, and their 2 children made the 110-mile journey to Lichfield. Barber was able to make good use of Johnson's local connections, who seemed to have welcomed him. He took a house on Stowe Street, where the family stayed for 7 years, paying £12 a year in rent. The owner was a Mrs. Jane Gastrell, sister of Molly and Elizabeth Aston. The sisters were almost exact contemporaries of Johnson and had known him all their lives. Barber came to be on good terms with Richard Green, the owner of the famous Lichfield Museum of Curiosities and a friend of Johnson's, and also with Anna Seward, a considerable literary figure in Lichfield whose work Johnson admired, though his views were not entirely reciprocated. Not everybody was quite so welcoming. Lucy Porter, Johnson's stepdaughter from his marriage to Teddy, was still living in Lichfield, and Barber called on her soon after he arrived in Lichfield. Lucy had always had a good relationship with Johnson, unlike her siblings, who would have nothing at all to do with him. Barber presented to Lucy her mother's wedding ring. After Elizabeth Johnson's death in 1752, Johnson had kept it in a small wooden box in which was pasted the inscription Aheu. Elizabeth Johnson, nupta July 9, 1735. Mortua, Aheu. Mart. 1752, alas. Elizabeth Johnson, married July 9, 1735. Died, alas. 17th of March, 1752. It was clearly an item of enormous sentimental value, but Lucy rejected the gift. Her reasons for doing so are unknown. Perhaps an item so intimately linked to both her mother's remarriage and her death was simply too disturbing. Barber had the ring enameled and presented it to his wife in memory of Johnson. He had it inscribed Samuel Johnson LLDOB December 13, 1784 A75. Lucy Porter had her own memories of Johnson and had no need to learn about him from Barber, but others were fascinated by what he had to tell. Barber became a minor celebrity, sought out by both locals and visitors, eager to hear his tales of Sam Johnson, the son of the local bookseller, who had ended up with a funeral in Westminster Abbey. Barber soon discovered that connection with a celebrity was not without its disadvantages. In March 1786 Mrs. Piozzi published her Anecdotes of Samuel Johnson, with its humiliating account of Barber's embarrassment at the attentions paid to his wife by Mrs. Piozzi's servants, and its sneer at Barber's delicacy. Hawkins and Boswell were also at work on biographies of Johnson, and this battle of the biographers kept Barber in the public eye. The month after the appearance of Piozzi's volume, Peter Pindar, the pseudonym of John Wolcott, published a satirical poem, Bozzi and Piozzi, or The British Biographers. A pair of town eclogues, in which Boswell and Piozzi appealed to the judgment of John Hawkins as to who is the more able biographer. As part of her case, Mrs. Piozzi recounts again the anecdote of Hodge the cat. To please poor Hodge, the doctor also kind, went out, and bought him oysters to his mind. This every day he hid, nor asked Black Frank, who deemed himself of much too high rank, with vulgar fish fags, to be forked to chat, and purchase oysters, for a mangy cat. Barber was trying to build a new life in Lichfield, and this kind of publicity could hardly have been helpful to him and his family, but much worse was to come. In March 1787 John Hawkins published his Life of Samuel Johnson, with its onslaught on Barber and its smear on his wife. Extracts from the book soon appeared in numerous papers, and Hawkins's charges became common knowledge, even among those who had not read the volume. For some readers Hawkins's account confirmed their suspicions about the black population as a whole. In June of 1787 a correspondent to the St. James's Chronicle wrote, in a letter quoted in a previous chapter, "I am not surprised at the base ingratitude of Johnson's black, as mentioned by Sir John Hawkins. The truth is, these people are the worst race of men on the habitable globe." The letter did not go unanswered. A week later one respondent used it as the basis not only of a defense of the black population but also of an attack on slavery. Philanthropo wrote from Oxford, "I was not a little disgusted by some sentiments which lately appeared in your paper. Your nameless correspondent, from the instance of Francis Barber, takes occasion to abuse the whole race of the Negroes. Supposing the charge to be true, which yet may remain to be proved, that the late petulant and desultory biographer of Dr. Johnson brings against his black servant, what will this prove? That the whole Negro race are deficient in the moral sense, and that gratitude and principle never dwelt in an African breast. The whole race of Christians might as well be charged with hypocrisy and impurity from the criminal designs of some few. The observations of this correspondent may carry conviction to those who are engaged in the slave trade, and to those alone." The correspondent went on to launch an impassioned plea for the abolition of the slave trade. Here avarice is supported by cruelty and the wantonness of oppression authorized by the sanction of law. The particulars of this most abominable traffic are too long to be enumerated. Surely the thousands annually sacrificed to slavery, to filth, to wretchedness, and cruelty, loudly call for some speedy redress. Other news items treated Barber less as a basis for serious discussion and more as a figure of fun. The World and Fashionable Advertiser wrote, "Francis Barber, Esquire, late the black servant of Dr. Samuel Johnson, is applying to the mania of the times, and positively threatens the life of his late master. He further threatens, in a particular manner, to be regardful of poor Sir John Hawkins. With anecdotes of the watch. N.B. in point of writing, a bet or two have been made, in Tom Paine's shop, that the night is beat by the Negro. This is to be a black letter book." The phrase black letter book was a play on words, alluding to a book printed in Gothic typeface, to Hawkins's profession as an attorney, a black letter book being a law textbook, and, of course, to Barber's color. Barber soon heard about Hawkins's account and was deeply offended. In July of 1787 Richard Green wrote to Boswell, "Barber, poor man, has been much hurt by Sir J. Hawkins's illiberal treatment." Boswell had been quick to write to Barber to express his sympathy. This was genuine. He liked Barber and had always been on good terms with him. In this case, however, Boswell also had another motive. Barber had been very helpful to Boswell's work on his biography of Johnson, collecting for him some of the proof sheets of the lives of the poets, sending him original letters, and responding to queries about his life with Johnson. Now Boswell saw an opportunity to gain an advantage over his rival biographer. On June 29, 1787 he wrote to Barber, "Sir John Hawkins having done gross injustice to the character of the great and good Dr. Johnson, and having written so injuriously of you and Mrs. Barber, as to deserve animadversion, and perhaps to be brought before the spiritual court, I cannot doubt of your inclination to afford me all the helps you can to state the truth fairly, in the work which I am now preparing for the press." The spiritual court had jurisdiction over claims for slander. Barber was hardly likely to bring an action against Hawkins, but he was very willing to assist Boswell in any way he could, and if it damaged John Hawkins's interests, so much the better. An opportunity to help Boswell arose in connection with Johnson's diaries. Johnson had burned some of these volumes, but he spared at least 14 notebooks. In his biography Hawkins had boasted of his unique access to the diaries. As an executor of the will he was entitled to temporary possession of them, but he had no right to use them as a source for his book. The person who was entitled to them was Francis Barber, who, as residuary legatee, should have received all of Johnson's personal possessions except those items which had been made the subject of specific bequests. Boswell wanted the diaries, as well as any other materials written by Johnson, to use in his own work. He enclosed with his letter of 29th of June a draft of a letter to be signed by Barber and requested him to return 3 copies of it, one for each of Johnson's executors, Hawkins, Reynolds, and Scott. "Sir, as residuary legatee of the late Dr. Samuel Johnson I do now request that his diary and every other book or paper in his handwriting in the possession of his executors or any of them be delivered to, on my account as I understand them to be an undoubted part of my property." The letter was a calculated insult to Hawkins, making it clear that Barber knew that Hawkins had retained materials which were an undoubted part of Barber's property, as they certainly were, and had made use of them. Barber's reply, dated July 9, 1787, to Boswell's request, left him in no doubt of his willingness to assist in any way possible. "Sir, I had the unspeakable satisfaction of receiving your letter on Saturday last by the care of Mr. Green, and agreeable to your request with a heart full of joy and gratitude, I took pen in hand to inform you that I am happy to find there is still remaining a friend who has the memory of my late good master at heart, that will endeavor to vindicate his cause in opposition to the unfriendly proceedings of his enemies, as I myself am incapable of to undertake such a task. The aspersions Sir John has thrown out against my master as having been his own murderer are entirely groundless, as also his assertion concerning Mr. Healy's applying to me for relief. He never did, neither was he any ways allied to my master but by having been married to a relation of his who has been long dead." The reference to Hawkins having suggested that Johnson was his own murderer appears to be a garbled account of Hawkins's story of Johnson's last night. Barber must have heard this second-hand, as he had not at this time read Hawkins's book, as he went on to make clear. "I have not had the mortification to fall in with that impious production of Sir John Hawkins relating to the life of my dear master, but assure yourself, dear sir, it will be to me a subject of the greatest happiness to render a board of the unworthy and false proceedings of the above-mentioned gentleman, and from hence you may justly infer that fuller exposition of that basest of mortals, inasmuch as he is reflected not only on me and my consort, but on the unsullied character of the best of beings, my affectionate and unparalleled master, if necessity should require it, if God spare my life, for I am at present very poorly, I would willingly attest what I have related personally." Barber sent Boswell the authorization, and a week later Hawkins handed over some, although apparently not all, of the papers. The incident resulted in Barber's name appearing in the papers once again, the St. James's Chronicle for 21 July 24, 1787, reporting that Barber had rescued out of the hands of Sir John Hawkins all the diaries and manuscripts of the doctor, and deposited them with Mr. Boswell. "Mr. Barber, we hear, has written a letter full of honest indignation at the aspersions thrown both upon himself and his master by a late biographer." Given the speed with which this story became public knowledge, and Boswell's love of fighting his battles with Hawkins in the press, it is likely that he was the source of the story. But it seems that Boswell was still not satisfied, and a few months later he wrote to Barber again, requesting a written demand for Hawkins to hand over the diplomas of Johnson's honorary doctorates from Dublin and Oxford, and all other papers or books in his possession which belonged to Johnson. Barber agreed to help, and Boswell again drafted the request. "I hereby authorize you to demand from Sir John Hawkins all books or papers of any sort which belong to the late Dr. Samuel Johnson, that may be in his possession." The terms were again likely to irritate Hawkins, a formal demand, which Barber was perfectly entitled to make, in peremptory language, implying that Hawkins had not complied with his obligations as executor. 40 years later, Hawkins's daughter, Lady Sia Matilda, read this letter from Boswell to Barber and described it as an act of violence. Barber sent Boswell the demand, changing the words "the late" to "my late master," and Boswell notified Hawkins. This resulted in the April 19, 1788 meeting between Boswell and Hawkins where, as we have seen, Boswell raised the matters of the gold-headed cane and the watch and was taken by surprise at the courteous reception he received from Hawkins. He was given the few items which Hawkins still had in his possession, which amounted only to 3 pamphlets, the diplomas of Johnson's Dublin and Oxford degrees, and a few other papers. Hawkins's Life of Samuel Johnson prompted a mocking review in the August 1787 issue of the Gentleman's Magazine. It was the work of Richard Porson, a noted classical scholar who had a sideline in making witty pseudonymous contributions to the newspapers. Porson included in the review a parody of a missing page from the life in which Hawkins tells the story of the watch. And here, touching this watch already by me mentioned, I insert a notable instance of the craft and selfishness of the doctor's negro servant. A few days after that whereon Dr. Johnson died, this artful fellow came to me, and surrendered the watch, saying at the same time, that his master had delivered it to him a day or two before his demise, with such demeanor and gestures, that he did verily believe that it was his intention that he, namely Frank, should keep the same. Myself knowing that no sort of credit was due to a black domestic and favourite servant, and withal considering that the wearing thereof would be more proper for myself, and that I had got nothing by my trust of executor save sundry old books, and coach hire for journeys during the discharge of the said office, I took the watch from him, intending to have it appraised by my own jeweller, a very honest and expert artificer, and, in so doing, to have bought it as cheap as I could for myself, let it cost what it would. Upon my signifying this my intention to Frank, the impudent negro said, he plainly saw there was no good intended for him, and in anger left me. Hawkins was the target of Porson's parody, but its publication meant that once again Barber's name appeared in print. The attack on Barber by Hawkins and his Life of Samuel Johnson and the surrounding publicity were sufficient to make 1787 a very unpleasant year for the Barbers, and it was not over yet. In November, the newspapers announced a new publication. This day are published, price 2 shillings more Last Words of Dr. Johnson, consisting of important and valuable anecdotes, with some original and interesting stories of a private nature, relative to that great man. To which are added, several singular and unaccountable facts relative to his biographical executor, formerly chairman of the Quarter Sessions. By Francis Barber. Anyone who rushed out to purchase a copy of this work in the hope of reading an account of Samuel Johnson written by his former servant would have been disappointed. As the title page of the volume stated, the work was by Francis Barber, the crucial comma having been unaccountably omitted from the newspaper advertisements. The preface made it clear that the author was anxious to avoid any possible confusion. I am not the late Dr. Johnson's black, but his white, servant. My name is Francis, and I had the honor of dressing his wig. Were I apprehensive that my name's being suffered to stand in the title page of the present production could, in any degree, injure the sale of the invaluable work which is soon expected from that learned gentleman, Francis Barber, the word should have been omitted. I am conscious that I have forestalled many anecdotes which he otherwise would have made known, so many, indeed, that, from the moment of this pamphlet's publication, he will be so incensed as to look black in the face ever afterwards. Our names are not so similar as to delude the public into the idea that Mr. Francis, the Barber, is Mr. Francis Barber. The booklet consisted of 50 pages of scatological humor, together with some rather feeble imitations of Johnson's style. Mrs. Macaulay, the historian, was once crowned with laurel on her birthday, and she returned the compliment by begging to kiss the doctor's hand. "Madam," said the doctor, "you are at liberty to kiss my hand, as a woman, but as a Whig, you ought to think it an honor to be permitted to kiss my." Some careless readers suppose the work to be Barber's, and it sold well enough to justify a second edition. The European magazine reported that by those who only read the title page to this horrid mass of fraud as well as nonsense, it was, at first credulously supposed, that poor Frank Barber, the doctor's black servant, had commenced author. Barber was mortified at the appearance of the publication, and at the obvious association with his name, and he wrote to the newspapers denying that he was connected with it. But his attempts merely served to increase the publicity. The Morning Chronicle and London Advertiser for 26th of November announced that Francis Barber, who states himself to be the black servant of Dr. Johnson, must make his personal appearance before the printer, accompanied by some known friend of the deceased doctor, ere the letter signed Francis Barber can be admitted. Nothing but ocular demonstration can persuade the printer to pronounce black to be white. A supposed disclaimer appeared shortly afterwards. I, Francis Barber, Dr. Johnson's black, think it honestly my duty to tell everybody that the pamphlet just now printed, called More Last Words of Dr. Johnson, is not my penmanship. I have had some disputes with one of my master's executors, yet that's all made up, and be it how it will, I would not have told, if I had been so minded, half so much of him as they have said in that pamphlet, or of Mrs. Thrale or any of my master's friends, no, not for all what he left me. It was a notice which was calculated to increase interest in the pamphlet, and the next in the series carried on the running joke at Barber's expense, whereas an advertisement has appeared in this paper, impudently signed with the name of Francis Barber, and falsely stating that the new pamphlet, called More Last Words of Dr. Johnson, is not written by him. I do hereby contradict the assertion, and publicly protest that the production alluded to is written by me, Francis Barber. In spite of all this unwelcome attention, there is some evidence that Barber was still regarded as a respectable neighbor by those who knew him in Lichfield. In July 1788 local householders in his ward elected him a dozener, a sort of petty constable responsible for bringing before the Portmoat Court complaints concerning minor offences such as assaults, gossiping, or failure to attend the watch. The dozeners also had a ceremonial role, taking part in such occasions as the chairing of a newly elected Member of Parliament in the Lichfield Greenhill Bower. There was no parliamentary election while Barber was a dozener, but the Bower took place on Whit Monday 1789, during Barber's period of service. The Bower was a day-long festival which had its origins in the Court of Array or View of Men and Arms, an annual review of the local defence forces. It featured music, dance, processions, gunfire, and, according to one 1730s account, as much ale as the participants can possibly drink. It was understandably a very popular event. The proceedings commenced early in the morning when the sheriff, the town clerk, and the bailiffs were escorted from the Guildhall in the centre of Lichfield to Greenhill, where a bower had been erected. The dignitaries were accompanied by the 2 manorial constables, 10 armed men, 8 Morris dancers, a fool, and a band of musicians playing drums and fifes. After the court of array or view of men-in-arms had been proclaimed, the city officials remained in the bower whilst the rest of the procession marched off to the first ward and summoned its dozeners such as Barber. The party was then led by the dozeners, each carrying a halberd, the symbol of his office, and a posy, a decoration of flowers and greenery or a puppet with garlands. They marched through the ward while a volley was fired over each house, and then back to the bower, the procession now including all the householders of that ward, on pain of a 1d fine. The constable's party then repeated the procedure for the next ward, and so on until all the 21 wards had been summoned. Each return to the bower was marked by more food and drink. Writing in 1801, the Staffordshire historian Stebbing Shaw noted, "It is generally late in the evening before they have finished their painful task." The last procession of the day involved all the marchers, including the dozeners with their halberds and posies. They marched back from Greenhill along Boar Street and Sadler Street, now called Market Street, passing on the way the house where Johnson had been born and brought up. He had watched the procession in the 1720s, and saw it again in 1779. In the marketplace the town clerk gave a speech, the dozeners placed their posies in St. Mary's Church, God Save the King was sung, and everyone went home. Barber lasted only a year as a dozener. His term of office was not renewed in July 1789, and he was never re-elected. He was now about 47, and for some years his troubles had been increasingly compounded by ill health. Medical bills increased the demands on his financial resources, which had been further stretched by the birth of his 4th child, Anne, in November 1786. In his July 1787 letter to Boswell, discussed above, Barber reported that he was at present very poorly, and in March 1788 he wrote that he had been prevented from writing sooner, not having been very well. On April 2, 1788 he wrote to Boswell again, apologizing that he had not been able to write sooner, having had return of my old complaint. He went on. My disorder together with that of 3 of my children lately having had the smallpox, has been very expensive to me, so that I am at present rather distressed, and find some difficulty to discharge my rent for this year, for which reason I shall ever acknowledge as a particular favour if you would advance me £10, which I will repay as I can turn myself about, to release me from my present uneasy situation. Barber's reference to 3 of my children is puzzling. The phrase seems to suggest that he had at least 4 surviving children, but the only Barber children known to have been living in April 1788 were Elizabeth, Samuel, and Anne. The Barber's first son, also named Samuel, had died in 1775. No record of any other child has been found, and in 1799 Barber stated on oath that he had 3 children. It seems most likely that it is simply a misleading choice of wording in this letter. Barber's letters often contain mistakes of grammar or spelling and misuse of words, and on at least one occasion he had a draft letter corrected by a friend. The sum of money which Barber wanted to borrow was substantial, almost exactly what he had earned in a year in the Navy, but Boswell promptly replied, "As I am very sensible of your obliging disposition towards me, I am glad that I can accommodate you with the sum which you want, for which I enclose you a bank post bill." Boswell had also given some thought to ways in which Barber could improve his financial position. "Some of your old master's friends have thought that your opening a little shop for a few books and stationery wares in Lichfield might be a good thing for you. You may consult, and consider of it." Barber never took up the idea of opening a shop. By December of 1788, he was writing to Bishop Percy, again about the subjects of health and money. "The infirmities I have incessantly laboured under, together with those attendant on age, not to mention the severe illness, from which my wife has with great difficulty recovered and the indisposition of my eldest daughter is continually subject to, have universally concurred, and in some measure compelled me to solicit your lordship to remit me, if convenient, the sum of £50 from the bond together with the small interest due thereon the 10th of November last. I should not have troubled your lordship, but as Christmas is drawing near and it is customary for apothecaries and other tradespeople to bring in their accounts, some of which I have already received, and much larger than I ever expected, I have it not in my power, without the assistance of your lordship, to discharge the same with my quarterly annuity, except I leave myself destitute of money." The letter is signed by Barber but has been written by someone else, suggesting that ill health prevented him from writing personally. He later mentioned a problem with his eyesight, The bond to which Barber referred was the £150 lent by Johnson to Percy and referred to in Johnson's will. The bishop had last sent money to Barber in March of that year, when he remitted £45. This sum was 6 years' interest, which for some reason had not been paid. On this occasion Percy promptly complied with Barber's request, sending him £57.10 on December 26, 1788, as repayment of £50 of the capital of the loan, together with interest. The constant references to money raised the question of what had happened to Johnson's legacy. The significance for the Barbers of the £1,500 inheritance and the £70 annuity becomes clear when it is compared to the wages they were receiving from Johnson, £7s a week for Frank and £5s a week for Elizabeth, in total £31.4 a year. In addition, they were provided with board and lodging, and Johnson probably bought their clothes. In the 1780s a footman in a household with a number of servants might earn 13 or 14 guineas a year, and a maid of all work might make 9 or 10 guineas as well as tips, clothing, board, and lodging. Even among the most highly skilled craftsmen there were very few who could hope to make anything like £70 a year. In his Life of Samuel Johnson Hawkins gives some details about the payments to Barber under Johnson's will. From the time of the doctor's decease, myself, and my colleagues the other executors, answered all the calls of Francis for money. On the 6th day of September 1785, we had advanced him £106. By the 13th of December following, he had received of Mr. Langton for his annuity, and of Mess. Barclay and Perkins for interest, as much as made that sum £183, and on the 15th of the same month, a year and 2 days after his master's death, he came to me, saying, that he wanted more money, for that a few halfpence was all that he had left. Upon my settling with him in August 1786, it appeared that, exclusive of his annuity, he had received £337 and, after delivering to him the bond for £150 mentioned in the will, I paid him a balance of £196 15s 4d 3/4. According to this account, by December 15, 1785 Barber had spent almost £289, a very substantial sum of money. Assuming that the £106 paid on September 6, 1785 is not part of the figure of £337, then by August 1786 Barber had received at least £639 15s 4/3/4d, as well as the annuity. The bond for £150 delivered to Barber is the document evidencing the loan to Percy, not the actual money. At that point the account was settled so far as Hawkins was concerned. In November 1786 he wrote to Bishop Percy, "Francis Barber is an exceedingly worthless fellow. He is gone to reside at Lichfield, and I have settled my account with him." It is not clear how these sums relate to the total value of the bequest. As we have seen, Hawkins recorded this as being near £1,500 and a sum little short of £1,500. The suggestion that Barber went through the money quickly is supported by Lady Sia Matilda Hawkins, who wrote, "When my father had to carry the will into effect, he was obstructed in every way by Francis. As fast as he drew money, so fast he spent it, and came for more. I remember seeing him, with all the vulgar insolence of a hackney coachman, chuck up a few halfpence, which, he said, without rendering any reason, were all he had remaining of a large sum which he had received very shortly before, and urging Sir J. H. most indecorously to precipitation for which he might have been called to account, and this, when, had it not been that my father laboured the point incessantly, Francis, after all his master's vain boasting, and unfeeling disregard of nearer connections, would have been left to the labour of his hands for a subsistence. My father then lost all consideration for the fellow, who, as if he had had only the justification of the acting executor in view, as quickly as possible reduced himself to the refuge of a workhouse. That John Hawkins lost all consideration for the fellow is not perhaps saying a great deal. But even if we make allowances for some exaggeration, so far as is known Barber was never in a workhouse. It does seem that Barber ran through his legacy at some speed, and was unable to live on the £70 a year. He was not good at handling money, no doubt in part because he was unused to dealing with such sums. There is evidence that he did not, at first, understand how the payment of the annuity would work. In October 1786 Bennet Langton wrote to him, explaining that a sum was payable every quarter by George Stubbs. To repeat what I have said before very distinctly, an account of the life of Barber's son Samuel recorded that his parents were improvident, strove to make a figure in the world, lived above their means, and dissipated their property. This may not be very reliable, as it was written from second-hand information and was not published until 1829, but contemporary witnesses tell the same story. Late in 1790 Anna Seward wrote to Boswell, "I am afraid poor Frank Barber has been very imprudent in that Dr. Johnson's kindness has but little answered its purpose. I have given him 3 guineas for a carpet so worn, and threadbare, that it is not worth one. I was pleased with the idea of treading upon a surface so classical, and did not wish to have a good bargain." On September 29, 1790 Barber was writing to Boswell in despair about his situation. He once again used a third party to pen the letter, "as my eyes are not so good as they were some time back. I wish I never had come to reside at this place, but being persuaded by my late poor dear worthy master, to whom I was, and ought, in duty bound, to oblige, was the occasion. Some time ago, I was extremely ill for a considerable time, which of course incurred a long doctor's bill, which when I came to pay astonished me greatly at the total thereof, however I paid it, viz. 23.5.6, and some few months prior thereto, I observe, I paid him, and another of the faculty, upon account of myself, my wife and family, £14 odd. I have also been at a great expense in the care and education of my children, as it is my wish, upon my master's account, to see them scholars." In the picture painted by Barber, he had at first been welcomed by local tradesmen who, doubtless knowing of the legacy, had been eager to extend him credit. But that had all come to an end. "When I first came here, people never minded, but rather urged to entrust me with articles into the house, but now they see me rather reduced, but can assure you has not been through my extravagancy in the least, but trusting in mankind to be honest and just, put too much confidence in them, who have now rewarded me for my pains, and through some spiteful enemy, or busy person, several with whom I dealt, hastily have sent in their bills, pressing immediate payment, as if in a manner they would eat me at once, and as my quarterly payment, as it becomes due, will not be sufficient to discharge the same and to leave me a farthing in pocket to subsist upon, and having no friend here to assist me, or confide in, beg you will assist me in my distressed situation." Barber asked Boswell for another loan, this time of £20, and also hoped for assistance in finding employment. He wrote that on the day of Johnson's funeral Edmund Burke had offered to assist if he ever wanted to go into service, and added, "I could wish, Burke, you, or some of my worthy master's friends would get me a place in the Stamp Office, India House, etc. I will leave this dead place as I cannot get any employ therein." Boswell had helped Barber by lending him money on a previous occasion, but he now had substantial debts of his own, as well as 5 growing children to provide for, and was trying to obtain a loan in order to buy some land. He replied to Barber, declining to lend him money but pointing out that the repayment terms Barber was offering Boswell would in fact be sufficient to satisfy Barber's creditors. There was a note of reproach too in his response. The original letter has not survived but Boswell summarized its contents in his register of letters, reminding him that his worthy master was attacked for the extraordinary liberality of the provision which he left to him. It would be a sad thing if the world should know that even that does not maintain him decently, advising him against leaving Lichfield which his master recommended as his residence, there he can live much cheaper, and with fewer temptations than in London. There is no further surviving correspondence between Barber and Boswell, but the following year John Holt wrote to Boswell, seeking information about Barber. Holt was a schoolmaster and antiquarian and the regular contributor of a meteorological diary to the Gentleman's Magazine. In June 1793 he visited Lichfield and sought out Barber. He wrote about his visit in his column in the magazine. "Francis is about 48, low of stature, marked with the smallpox, has lost his teeth, appears aged and infirm, clean and neat, but his clothes the worse for wear, a green coat, his late master's clothes, all worn out. He spends his time in fishing, cultivating a few potatoes, and a little reading. He laments that he has lost the countenance and table of Miss S., Mr., and many other respectable good friends, through his own imprudence and low connections." The Miss S. referred to was probably Anna Seward. Clearly, Barber was no longer acceptable company to her. It was probably in the same year that the Barbers left the house in Stowe Street, which had been their home since coming to Lichfield. It may have been that the rent of £12 a year was now beyond them. They subsequently moved several times but never again paid a rent as high as £10. As the money ran out, Barber turned to one of the few resources which was left to him. His master and friend Samuel Johnson remained a subject of enormous interest, and collectors were willing to pay for items associated with him. Barber started to sell off some of the objects he had inherited, Johnson's Bible, inkstand, and even the infamous watch, the very one which had been at the heart of the controversy with John Hawkins. In the spring of 1794, Canon Hugh Bailey of Lichfield Cathedral wrote to a friend, "Oh, how will Boswell envy me! No less than Dr. Johnson's watch is now in my possession. I purchased it of Francis Barber, his black servant, who is now settled at Lichfield, and I am afraid in great want, though his master left him almost all his property. But he has a wife, poor fellow, that brings him both black and white children, alternately. This strange chemical mixture has produced that bitter portion poverty. This is not the philosopher's stone." The barber's son Samuel was of a darker skin color than his sister Elizabeth. In 1863, Mary Webb Hickman Emery recalled that her father, Gregory Hickman, a Staffordshire surgeon, had employed a mulatto servant, Samuel Barber, in about 1797. As Bailey's comments demonstrate, it was a circumstance which provoked local gossip about his mother. There are many accounts of other items which were sold by Barber at this time, but some memorabilia were handed down to his son Samuel. One is particularly intriguing. Mary Webb Emery recalled that Samuel Barber had possessed several valuable articles which were said to have belonged to Johnson and which had been given to Hickman by Francis Barber, or possibly by Samuel Barber. These included a gold-headed cane. Perhaps the famous cane which Hawkins was supposed to have kept eventually found its way to Barber. The sale of the watch was not sufficient to keep the family going for long. Nothing had come of Barber's request to Boswell to help him find employment, and any hopes Barber may have had of further assistance from that quarter ended with Boswell's death in May 1795. Barber badly needed more income, and fortunately he saw an opportunity. When Dr. Charles Burney sought out Barber in Lichfield in 1797, he discovered that he had left the city for good. He had moved to Burntwood, a small village just a few miles away, and there he set up a school. Samuel Johnson's determination to make a scholar of Barber seems to have paid off at last, and he may have been the first black schoolmaster in Britain. Fittingly, the school was just a mile away from Medial, where Johnson had established a school more than 60 years earlier. Though his experience was not a happy one, Johnson's venture had ended in failure after less than 2 years. Barber must have judged that Burntwood was a suitable location for a school, perhaps because the village already had a charity school, which had been established in 1770. Nothing is known about Barber's school, but it seems unlikely that he intended to compete with the well-established charity institution. It is probable that his school was an elementary school, aimed at young children who might then go on to the charity school. Barber could also claim that Burntwood was a healthy spot for children. David Moss, master of the charity school from 1782 until 1808, advertised the well-known salubrity of Burntwood, as bordering on that healthful spot, Cannock Chase, and proudly boasted of a cold bath, erected at considerable expense within 20 yards of the school, for the use and convenience of such young gentlemen whose parents may be desirous of such an accommodation. Setting up a school was an act of considerable boldness, possibly touched by desperation, on Barber's part, especially if he knew that Johnson's attempt had been unsuccessful. There was no telling how the populace would react to their children being taught by a black man, and a former slave, at that, however well educated. A similar situation arose a few years later when an applicant for a teaching job in Bisley in Gloucestershire was required to produce a testimonial from a referee. The reference was generally positive but added, "Unfortunately he is a mulatto, a native of the West Indies, which circumstances, added to a family of 9 children, has kept him down in the world, where so dark a complexion is not objected to, he would make a very valuable schoolmaster." Whether because of attitudes to Barber's color or for some other reason, the school was not a success. National economic problems caused by the war with France may have been a factor. Prices rose very steeply in 1799 and leapt by 36% in 1800. Barber's financial difficulties continued, and in October 1799 he was obliged, as noted earlier, to appear before a magistrate to be examined under the Poor Law, an appearance which carried with it the hope of receiving some assistance, but also an underlying threat. The Poor Law was a complicated system under which every parish was obliged to collect money from those who could afford it and to make payments to those in need. In order for Barber to qualify for such relief, he had to have a settlement in the parish. The purpose of the examination was to determine whether in fact he did. The issue was particularly acute because the examination would determine not only whether he might obtain some very modest financial support from the parish, but also whether he and his family could remain there. A pauper who became a charge on a parish but who did not have a settlement there could be forcibly returned to the parish, perhaps hundreds of miles away, where he or she did have a settlement. It was not uncommon for paupers to be passed from one parish to another. Only 3 months before Barber's examination his son Samuel had been paid £60 by the overseers of the poor to attend a woman who was being sent from Burntwood to her former parish. In his statement, which was taken on oath, Barber said that he was about 52, and that he had been born in Jamaica in the West Indies, of which island his parents were natives. As we have seen, his belief about his age was probably incorrect. He went on to state that he hath lived in various services, but the last place in which he was hired and served a year was with Dr. Samuel Johnson in Bolt Court Fleet Street in the parish of St. Dunstan's in the West in the City of London, with whom he resided about 34 years and until the doctor's death. That soon after Dr. Johnson died this examinant went to live in the parish of St. Chad in the city and county of Lichfield, where he resided in a house then belonging to Mrs. Gastrell for about 7 years, for which he paid the yearly rent of £12. That he hath since rented at different times several other houses but never at any time rented £10 a year. That he hath now resident with him in Burntwood aforesaid his wife named Elizabeth and 3 children, Elizabeth aged about 15 years, Samuel aged about 13 years and Anne aged about 10 years. Barber was wrong about the ages of his children, who were not 15, 13, and 10, but 17, 15, and 12, respectively. But the key matters which decided the issue of his settlement were that he had served Johnson for over a year in the parish of St. Dunstan in the West, that he had lived in St. Chad's parish for several years, paying over £10 a year in rent, and that he had not paid over £10 a year since then. Serving a master for over a year or renting at more than £10 a year could establish a settlement, so Barber probably had a settlement in both St. Dunstan's and St. Chad's, but not in Burntwood. The result of the examination was that if he or his family became a burden on the parish, they could be returned to Lichfield or London. Francis and Elizabeth Barber remained in Burntwood, however, so it seems that they were never quite so desperate as to need parish assistance. The records of the parish overseer of the poor show no payments to them. They were to spend the last months of their life together in Burntwood. There is one surprising feature of Barber's poor law examination. He is described as of the township of Burntwood. Yeoman. The term yeoman could be used in different senses. Johnson provided 4 meanings in his Dictionary of the English Language, 1755. 1. A man of a small estate in land, a farmer, a gentleman farmer. 2. It seems to have been anciently a kind of ceremonious title given to soldiers, whence we have still yeomen of the guard. 3. It was probably a freeholder not advanced to the rank of a gentleman. 4. It seems to have had likewise the notion of a gentleman's servant. Of these meanings the fourth seems to be the one intended. It recalls Steele's reference to the esquire's loyal and long-standing servant, the description which Boswell applied to Barber. Whatever its precise meaning, it seems to suggest that Barber was still regarded as having a certain social status in the community. Barber had always suffered from ill health of some unspecified kind, a sickly lad, a malady in his throat, extremely ill, my old complaint, a troublesome disorder, and his health deteriorated during 1800. He was attended by Dr. Richard Wright, grandson of the Richard Green whom Barber had known in Lichfield in the 1780s, and in gratitude he gave to Dr. Wright a copy of the Satires of Juvenal which had belonged to Johnson. He probably had no other means of paying him. Barber did not respond to the treatment, and it was decided that an operation was required. In December he was taken into the Staffordshire General Infirmary. Surviving records show that the 11 patients admitted during the week ending Friday, December 12, 1800 included Francis Barber. The fact that Barber was admitted to the infirmary confirms his impoverished condition. The hospital, whose physician extraordinary was Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles, had been established in 1766 as a charity and admitted only poor patients, the rules laying down that no patients be admitted who are able to subsist themselves, and pay for medicines. It also indicates that he still had at least one local supporter, as anyone who was to be admitted to the infirmary, except for an accident victim, had to have a letter of recommendation from a benefactor of the hospital. It is not known who sponsored Barber, but one of those with the right to nominate patients was Canon Hugh Bailey of Lichfield Cathedral, who had bought Johnson's watch from Barber 5 years earlier. Perhaps the infamous watch had this last part to play in Barber's story. The nature of Barber's illness remains unknown. It could not have been regarded as incurable because of a strict rule that only patients believed to be curable would be admitted. The rule stated that no persons disordered in their senses, suspected to have the smallpox or other infectious distempers, having epileptic or convulsive fits, scrofulous complaints of long-standing, habitual ulcers, Cancers not admitting of an operation, consumptions or dropsies in their last stages, in a dying condition, or judged incurable, be admitted as inpatients, or if inadvertently admitted, be suffered to continue. The prospect of an operation would have been daunting in pre-anesthetic days when a little laudanum, a mixture of opium and sherry, or just alcohol would have been the best pain relief available. Whether the recovery rate was helped by the diet is not clear. On Friday 12th of December, the meals provided for patients such as Barber were a pint of milk porridge and 4 ounces of bread for breakfast, bread or suety pudding washed down with a pint of beer at dinner, and a pint of gruel for supper. The operation was performed not long after Barber's admission to the infirmary. It was described in his obituary in the Gentleman's Magazine as painful and was not a success. He lingered for a month, but on January 13, 1801 he died, aged about 57 or 58. He was buried in the churchyard of St. Mary's Church, Stafford, on 28th of January. The record of burials for that date includes Francis Barber from the infirmary. Underneath the entry an unknown hand has written Dr. Johnson's Negro servant.